Speaking with him this morning is Farrukh Dhondy, author, filmmaker, and writer. Farrukh has written The Bandit Queen. He's also written Mangal Pandey, The Uprising. Ladies and gentlemen, Nobel laureate Sir Vidya Naipaul.
Thank you.
Something like this? Yes. And help on this.
अभी ऑफ है ऑन कर दो
अभी ऑन कर दूं? हाँ सर.
Vidya, we're on. Okay? I think, look at me and talk to me. It's going to be right. Shall I start? Whenever you want. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We've already been introduced, so I won't do it again. This session is supposed to be the life and works of V.S. Naipaul. I'd like to say to the audience, to start with, that this is not going to be a biographical or an autobiographical session. We don't want to explore a whole life. Where were you born? Where did you live, etc. Neither is it going to be a critical session. I'm not going to dissect the works and ask him for that dissection. Of course, both aspects of life and work enter into a session such as this. And the subtitle of this session is Sir Vidya Naipaul in conversation with me. So that is what I think you're going to get. You're going to get me talking to Vidya as though we were sitting with a glass of white wine in Wiltshire looking out at the sunset. Is that all right, Vidya?
You were very romantic.
Right.
Sunset and everything. It's come in.
See that?
Farrukh is very romantic. He's already talked about the sunset. And, I don't like talking about sunsets because it can be used against one. It can be used to say that one is at the sunset of one's life or one's work or things like that. And it's a very unhappy metaphor.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't say twilight at least. I said sunset. Okay. And we've experienced those with you sitting at the window and observing the birds coming and eating food in Wiltshire from your baskets. Okay, let's start. Vidya, let's touch on a bit of an aspect of your life. Please tell people how you came to be born in Trinidad.
Well, it had nothing to do with me.
No.
It had everything to do with my family.
That's right.
And my parents.
That's what I want.
Yes. And I suppose you want to find out how we got to Trinidad,
Yes.
that family. Well, in the middle of the 19th century, there began a small migration from India to these places in the Caribbean. And that was it, really. Having been migrated, we had to live with the results of that migration, and I'm one of the examples, or one of the results of that migration. Okay?
I don't agree. You're one of the triumphs of that migration. Now, tell me, where did the urge to begin writing come from? I knew that your grandfather came to Trinidad to work as a laborer. Your father didn't do anything of the sort. He never worked as a laborer. He was a writer, and I've read his works. Where did your urge to begin writing come from? Where did the inclination come from?
I got it from my father, who was a journalist, and who, from being a journalist, began to have literary ambitions. And he would read to me from the books he had, and which is part of my education, an important part of my education. And from these two sources, my father's ambition and my father's educating of me, I began to develop the wish to be a writer. I should tell you straight away that there probably was no reason for that wish. It didn't mean that I had special literary judgment. It didn't mean I had things or great things to write about. In fact, I didn't. I had to find all these things out later when I settled down to being a writer.
Right. I know you went to Queen's Royal College, one of the best schools of the Caribbean, and then won a scholarship to Oxford. Now, I don't want to dwell on your Oxford days, but somewhere in one of your essays, you have written about a writer finding his or her material. And I think you said that the material finds you rather than you finding the material. Can you tell us a bit about how you found your material, how you knew that is what you were destined to write, as it were?
It was just as hard for me as it is for most people in this audience who suddenly were told, you have to be a writer.
Yeah. Speak. Go on. Into it.
I had to find out what I had to write about. I didn't know what I was going to write about. And when I began, when I left Oxford, I literally left Oxford one day, one Saturday, took the train up to London and went to live in a cousin's flat. And then I thought I would set myself up as a writer without having any training or ambition or knowledge of what it meant to be a writer. I was without any, I had no, I want you to understand this, I had no training, no ambition, no great. I know when people say they want to be writers, they go on to say that they were always writing since they were 10 or something. And, but that wasn't so with me. I wanted to be a writer without having anything to write about. I had to find out what I wanted to write about. Farrukh, is that okay?
That's perfect, Vidya. How did the idea, I believe the first stories you wrote were Miguel Street,
Yes.
even though they weren't the first published.
Yes.
How did Miguel Street come to you? What was it about? And the room in Langham.
It was a great bit of luck, because I had been trying to write for a while. I had written certainly one very, very bad book. A book so bad that when I sent it to an English critic to look at for me, his reply in a day or two was, you should give this up, forget this work, do something else. And I did just that. I forgot that work and I looked around for something else. And one day, in the BBC, they had a room on the second floor of the Langham Hotel, which in those days was part of the BBC.
Keep going.
What's happening?
Keep going. Keep going.
Drama behind me?
No, we'll deal with that in a minute.
Where was I from?
You were at the Langham,
Yes.
and the first book had been rejected,
Yes.
and they told you to do something else. And so at the Langham, a different dimension, a different idea came to you. That's where you were.
Well, at the Langham Hotel, there's a room for freelancers. It was on the second floor.
By the way, the Langham Hotel was part of the BBC, where Vidya was working as part of the Caribbean service.
Yes, yes, yes.
So,
And there were 2 or 3 typewriters in the freelancers' room. And one day, I sat down out of pure idleness in front of one of the typewriters and began to write on BBC paper something. And what I told myself that day was that you will not leave this sheet of paper until you come to the end of what you're writing. And so I took it on to the end. And that was the great breakthrough I had, taking a piece of work on to the end like that. Does that
yes,
help you?
yes. But the material that you wrote about, the subject that you wrote about,
Yes.
was, as you've written somewhere, it overtook you, it overtook your mind, and you wrote about your neighbors in Port of Spain.
Yes. I was able, thinking about what I should do, I was able to go back to childhood memories of Port of Spain, where I'd spent the first 18 years of my life. And out of those memories, there came to me one particular moment that I thought I should write. And I wrote that out. You see, there's nothing to tell people about what I did, and I have no great message for people.
No, I think the books speak for themselves.
Yes,
The
yes,
stories speak for themselves. And you were at the time working in the Caribbean service of the BBC.
Yes.
So you must have been interacting with the writers of the time from the Caribbean Voices and so forth.
Yes.
And then I read an essay by yourself a couple of years after you left Oxford about the honesty that was needed in Caribbean writing. Do you remember that essay? You published it in the Trinidad Guardian.
I can't remember.
You can't remember it. I think you said that Caribbean writing had been imitative and dishonest so far, and something else was needed. They needed a great leap forward. Who were the other writers writing at the time from the Caribbean? I can recall their names, but they seem to have disappeared.
They have disappeared, all of them. No point in calling their names now. The names wouldn't mean much.
Wilson Harris?
No, he wasn't one of... He was a remote and a rather grand figure. C.L.R. James cracked him up a lot. But the people around London and the BBC, West Indian or Caribbean service, were simpler people. Samuel Selvon, George Lamming. Lamming was a one-book writer. Selvon was more complicated, but a very fine man. These were the two main figures. But I can't talk about these people. It would have no meaning if you haven't read their work. So I will do this with great diffidence.
Yes, but what I would say about it,
Yeah.
even though I've promised the audience not to be literary critical, is that their work, George Lamming, Wilson Harris, whose prose I could not make out, I could never understand what he was saying. But I did read George Lamming and so on, and they were very provincial in their approach, as it were.
Yeah.
And the only writer that has really survived from that time is, respectfully, yourself. Yeah. And it has made an international impact rather than the provincial impact of stuff from the Caribbean, is what I would say in a critical way.
Well,
The one person we share in common, whom we both knew as such, was C.L.R. James.
Yeah.
I very much later wrote his a sort of biography. But the first thing I read, one of the first things I read by you was in a magazine. I was still in India, a magazine called Encounter, which we later discovered was financed by the CIA. But at the time, of course, fine writers wrote for it. Stephen Spender and Melvin Lasky's magazine. You wrote a review of C.L.R. James' Beyond a Boundary.
Yeah.
Which was, can you tell us anything about that? About the book, about C.L.R. James himself?
Well, I read the book, Beyond a Boundary. It was about cricket. It was a particular way of writing about cricket. He was writing about cricket as it affected him as a child looking on, and later as someone trying to play the game, and later on as a journalist and a thinker about the effect of the game on the Caribbean. And I read the book and I was utterly fascinated by it. And so I thought I should write about it. I had written an earlier work for Encounter about Niraj Chowdhury. So the two pieces hung together in my mind.
Yes. About Nirad, later on, I think you praised his first book, his autobiography of an unknown Indian.
Yeah.
But later on, I don't think you found much sense or worth in his writing, put it that way.
I'll tell a little story about that.
Please.
I went to a gathering in London at about that time, and there was a woman writer and a critic called Margarita Lasky there, and she began to talk to me about Indian writing. I tried to tell her that there were good figures in Indian writing. She wasn't having any of that at all.
And?
I'm hearing a speaker there.
It is, I don't know what they're doing there. Somebody should shut them up, or at least turn it down. I'll take the opportunity in the break to introduce Nadira Lady Naipaul, whose assistance I solicited when I said Vidya and I were to speak, but maybe we'll have pauses and you can fill in, so Nadira's right here writing notes. Okay, they're quietening down the disturbance. So,
But what I wanted to say about
Yes.
Margarita Lasky was that she said, these writers are no good. And I said, but Chowdhury is a very grand figure. She said, no. And the tragic point of view from my way of looking at things was that when later I read the autobiography of an unknown Indian, I was compelled to agree with her. It's a very strange book and not a great piece of writing. I'll tell you about Chowdhury, and I'll see what, I'm sure many people here know his work. Somebody left the Encyclopedia Britannica in his family house in Calcutta. And he began to read this Encyclopedia Britannica. And that was how he prepared for an examination. He read the Encyclopedia Britannica and went to write an examination. And he had an extraordinary bit of luck that the first examination he wrote, he could refer to the Encyclopedia Britannica, which he had read. But later, they didn't always come together.
Well, things haven't changed that much, you know. This generation reads Wikipedia instead of the Encyclopedia Britannica. But when they're plagiarizing somebody else's work, they don't acknowledge it. At least Nirat Chowdhury did. So things have moved on a bit, but not that much. Let's get to the first comic novels, or so-called comic novels, that were published. You wrote Miguel Street,
yes,
but it didn't get published straight away.
No.
Why not?
I'll tell you why not. Many people here will know about this kind of attitude. That went to the publisher I was having relations with, Andre Deutsch. He no longer publishes, he's dead, of course. Where was I, Farrukh?
At Miguel Street, and why it didn't get published?
Yes. Andre was an old-fashioned publisher. He believed...
Andre Deutsch.
Yes, Andre, yes. He believed that you mustn't publish short stories because there's no market for short stories. So, you know, that would have knocked me out of court almost as soon as he got the book. And because he thought that this book, Miguel Street, was a set of stories and didn't deserve to be published, he knocked it out. What was I to do? But young men starting to write have to face these things, and we mustn't blame publishers too much for their indifference or their unkindness to one's early work.
But it did induce you to go on to write Mystic Marcia.
Yes, so the thing
Which
was that I had a great, probably wrong-headed belief in my own talent, and I thought whatever I did was going to be all right in the end. And so I wrote on after the rejection of Miguel Street by Andre and things like that. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that I had a great faith in myself and my talent, and I felt too that if I wasn't true to my talent, if I wasn't true to myself, that would be the end of me as a person. that I had to stay with my talent. And so that is what I did. I kept on writing in spite of all the drawbacks and lack of encouragement.
Right. Incidentally, Vidya, I haven't said this to you before, but I think Andre Deutsch was wrong about Miguel Street. I don't believe that it's a group of short stories. I believe it's a concatenation of writing that has an integral atmosphere and therefore you can't call it a novel, but then you have always played with form, haven't you?
Yes.
Way in the World and 10 other books I can mention are not conventional in that they're not novels. They're sometimes this and that. They're sometimes autobiographical. They're sometimes incidents from Trinidad that mix with pieces of history, for instance.
Yes.
And
I tried to tell Andre this when we talked about Miguel Street and why he had rejected it. This might seem a very nice way of going about it, talking to a publisher who's rejected you, sitting and talking with him in a civilized way. But it was like that with him.
And then from the same trove of material, you wrote The Suffrage of Elvira, which I believe was vaguely based on your mother's family and the politicians in Trinidad that it read.
Yes. They were politicians, they were looking for votes. And I went with an uncle and to one or two of his canvassing meetings, and it occurred to me quite late that this was a good way of discovering material, traveling and finding people and to ask for their vote. It was a wonderful way to meet people. And so I wrote it. And there we are.
It's a funny book.
It's a funny book. I like it. The dialogue is wonderful.
So is Mystic Marcia. It's a funny book. But then you came to A House for Mr. Biswas, which, though it has an extremely strong vein of comedy, and only after years after I read it, ladies and gentlemen, Vidya told me, did you notice that some of the people were called George, this and that? He had named minor characters, ironically, after other Caribbean writers.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that. I didn't know that George was George Lamming, for instance. Who else?
Edgar was Edgar Mittelholzer.
Edgar Mittelholzer, yes.
And Sam was Sam Selber. So it was kind of light humor can support one through many bad days, you know.
Indeed. But Biswas was actually, with the vein of comedy, it's a very serious book.
Very serious.
It's a serious book, and it has veins of tragedy feeding it.
Yes.
Arteries, I should say.
It is a serious book.
Yeah.
Tell
us about it.
What I used to tell people and tell myself in the very early days was that I had to begin small. An ambition, in the sense of a bigger book, would come to me in time. And so that explains why I waited so long to start writing The House, you know?
Yes.
I waited a long time for that. Again, there's nothing from that experience, the visitor here, it's a bit of luck, really, because I wasn't getting on with my other writing, and then I had this idea And it took time. It took time.
Yes, of course, you shouldn't say that. It's one of the great books of the century, as Hanif and Paul and Amit Chaudhary were saying from this very platform the other day.
Yes.
And it's an unusual book insofar as it doesn't imitate anything. And through all our conversations over the years, you've always said that what the main thing about a writer is to be fresh.
Yes.
I remember you saying that even Dickens went wrong when he began to repeat himself and not be new. And I know it has been one of the credos of your writing that you wanted to write something new. And the first possibly very different book from the novels was The Middle Passage,
Yes.
which is your discovery, the rediscovery of the Caribbean islands.
Yes.
How did that come about?
I'll tell you, it's a rather interesting story.
Tell us.
I went back to Trinidad a few times, and on one of those short visits, I was invited by the Prime Minister of Trinidad, Eric Williams, to lunch. And I went to this place and we had a very plain lunch, fried plantains, and a few other fried things.
Delicious.
A very fried lunch. And during this lunch, Eric Williams said I should write about the Caribbean. He talked a lot about the French islands, and everything he said about them excited me. I had no idea that we who were living close to those islands were so close to brutality and prejudice. I had no idea. So I did agree to writing that book on the suggestion of Eric Williams. And then I found something else, or found out about something else. I found that you might think you can write do non-fiction about real places, but it's just as hard as writing a novel. I found that out. And so I had to learn again how to write about real events and real people and real places. So my life at this stage, up to this stage, was an affair of learning. I was learning how to write the stories, learning how to write the early comic books, and then I was learning how to write travel books. They were not, everyone was different from the other. So I had to learn all of that. And this leads me to a point that my life as a writer was always a process of learning. Everything I wrote about was something I had to learn. And I don't know whether this will help anyone in this audience, that a writer has to learn all the time. But that's what I felt about. Does that help you?
That helps a lot. The only thing I'd object to is you're calling it a book of travel. The Middle Passage is not a travelogue. It's the discovery of islands anew, about which nobody had written in that particular way. And that brings me to what this audience is probably waiting for. It brings me to your first trip to India. And you're spending a year here and then producing an area of darkness, your first book about India. Let me start by asking you, why did you come to India? Why India?
Well, obvious reason is that my ancestral land, and I wanted to have a feeling about it, to see what was there. And then when I talked to Andre Deutsch, he agreed to give me an advance on any book I might write about the Caribbean islands or anything I might write about India. So he made this offer to me, and they were very valuable at the time. £500, I think, was the figure. It seems petty now, and it probably was petty then, but I was very pleased to get it.
So what did you do? How did it begin? Where did you come?
And so I went to India. And there again, there was trouble from my point of view, because I didn't know how to move when I was in India. And I eventually had to find my way. What I want to say, and I've said it already, is that I had to learn all the time, and it was part of my process, part of the process of being a writer, this process of learning. So after all the learning of the earlier books, I learned about how to write a non-fiction work. It's a very simple thing to find out about. You know, I began to write as though I was a traveler from the metropolis. And this meant I was imitating other writers I had read. And what I did, foolishly, you know what happens? When you write frivolously and in an imitation way, it doesn't come out. It doesn't help.
Are you saying, Vidya, that there was, before An Area of Darkness, as we can read it, there was a different sort of writing that you were experimenting with or that you discarded?
Yes, I suppose so.
Is that what you're
suppose.
saying? Yes.
Yes.
Well, I read An Area of Darkness when I was in college in Pune, and it struck me as the most remarkable description I had ever read of India, because growing up in the 50s and 60s, I had absorbed Indian nationalism unquestioningly. And suddenly An Area of Darkness gave me the view that you can look at India differently and you can say things about its habits, its traditions, its prejudices, its middle classes, the decor of their homes, the way that Indians, how do we put it in India, commit nuisance on the streets. And I know that the reaction was rather bad. Nissim Ezekiel, a poet who used to be a friend at the time, I knew him in Bombay, said, oh, this is doing dirt on India and so forth. I don't know if you were aware of any of that reaction.
Yes, but not at the time of writing. I was aware of it afterwards. And I was slightly bewildered by it, you know? Because clearly what I had written had been written out of a wish to be true to the facts of one's vision, and it was not written out of prejudice or anything like that. And yet this was thrown out at me. So what I did, I learned to live with all of this.
Nadira says,
When Vidya wrote An Area of Darkness, and he was bewildered by the reaction, but his family was also taken aback, especially his mother. His mother had only one Indian word that she still carried with her, and that was beta. And she said, "Beta, leave India to the Indians."
I remember years later I talked to CLR James.
Yes.
Right? And what he said to me was, how could Vidya call India an area of darkness? It was the land of Gandhi, the land of Nehru, the land of the advance of colonialism. And I said, you obviously haven't read the book because it's not about the advance of India.
Yes.
It's about what Vidya Naipaul saw and how he talked to people
Yes.
and what he observed of the streets and houses and paintings and habits and hypocrisies of this and that.
The title is not, as some people think, writing about a dark area. It's writing about the darkness of a place which was presented to me all my life, a remote area. And I thought of that area as an area of darkness. I knew nothing about it.
It was, in a sense, an attempt to regain your family history, wasn't
It
it?
was an attempt to do that, yes.
And you found that there was none of it left.
Yes, yes.
It was dust. Right, I skip a few years and come to your second contention in India. You made another trip to India in order to write a book of discovery.
Yes.
And again, you called it a wounded civilization.
Yes.
And people wondered why it was, in that sense, negative. I know it wasn't negative myself. I read the book. But you've told me later that you were searching for something and you had hints of it in the writings of R.K. Narayan, in your travels through India. What did you mean by a wounded civilization? Why were you calling it wounded?
It was an attempt to suggest the effect of history on India, the effect of the various invasions. That was it. That was really what was in the back of the writer's mind. Is that enough for you? Or you?
A little more detail. The very moving and extremely graphic description of going to Hampi, the Vijayanagar capital.
Yes.
Can you say something about that?
Yes. Well, before I went to India, I read a few books about India, not many. And one of the books I read was a book by, oh goodness, I've forgotten the name of the writer. Was it Rawlinson or something like that?
Rawlinson, yes.
And he wrote about the history of India, and this got me excited about Hampi, because I'd never read about Hampi and that bit of India before. And so that sent me, when I was in India, to make a long, difficult journey to this Vijayanagar city.
The book, you've told me later on in conversation that you knew that there was a wound to this civilization.
Yes.
And you explored the outer manifestations of it.
Yes.
But you didn't, you admitted, get quite to the nub of what that wound was, or why the civilization had become hybridized or affected by the successive colonial invasions.
Yes. That is so, Farrukh. That is so. That is so.
Anyway, we won't get into the controversies of it, but years later, the BBC called me to interview you about your latest book on India, India, A Million Mutinies Now. And they said, it's just going to be published, read it rapidly, which I did with absolute fascination, especially because it started with the Parsis in Persepolis, for God's sake. You know, and I thought, nobody's ever written about Parsis landing in Persepolis and crying at the ruins, and I like that. I'll go to Persepolis one day and cry there myself. But it started that way, and then Bombay, and then an entire anti-clockwise journey. It taught me a lot about India. I hadn't known the history of Periyar or the South until you touched upon it, because in school and college and whatnot, one didn't quite do that. And I detected that you were taking a slightly different attitude to India. But to tell this audience the truth, when I put that to you, you said, you are already giving me marks. And I said, oh dear, have I said the wrong thing, put the wrong question, and so forth. But we did talk on the BBC. And I asked you what I'm going to ask you again. You made an assessment of 1 million mutinies.
Yes.
I thought it was very accurate. What did you mean by that?
Well, with the great social movements in India, there are a lot of individual mutinies. No longer we must think of a mutiny as being a violent movement against authority. Think rather in a smaller way of people like myself and like other people who were trying to establish a new identity for themselves in the world. And so there were all these mutinies, as I saw it, 1 million mutinies. It's a nice title.
It is a good title.
Good title.
And I began to agree with your point of view, though I know that very many of my friends and associates could not see anything positive in particular movements. You wrote about, quite controversially, in Wounded Civilization and in 1 Million Mutinies, that democratic movements allowed sections of the population who had had no voice at all for thousands of years
Exactly.
to complete it, if you like,
Yes.
to come to the fore,
Yes. Yes.
such as the Shiv Sena,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And of course, you weren't saying you agree with all the Shiv Sena's policies or that taxi drivers from UP ought to be driven out of Bombay, but you were saying that this democracy has endowed people
Exactly.
with a new voice.
That was it. That was it. Yes.
And you used a very telling phrase. It was, which one of your interlocutors gave you, it was Atma Vishwas.
Yes.
You remember that?
Yes, yes, yes. Very nice, huh?
Very nice phrase.
Very nice.
Good. Yeah. And I think that the Atma Vishwas has gone quite far in India. You had, in later years, a chief minister from the Dalit community. Because of the force of numbers, she became chief minister of the UP. And that is a triumph for democracy, something one had not seen for 3,000 years.
Yes, yes.
Sorry, I got carried away.
No, you spoke very well.
You Thank you, Vidya. There were also books of travel, books of discovery in Africa.
Yes.
several of them.
Yes.
The earlier one was Mauritius, overcrowded Barracoon. Later on, of course, there were the crocodiles of Yamoussoukro. You'd been all over Africa and done quite original work on it. Can you tell us something about those travels, why you did them? Why
Well, this is
Africa?
my background and my past coming out, because growing up as I did in Trinidad and the Caribbean, I was aware of the African population around us. And so this wish to go to Africa more than once, to different parts of Africa, was related to that.
Right, because the Caribbean has a lot of African,
Absolutely.
Afro-Caribbeans.
Absolutely.
And you discovered some new things, even in your latest book, one of your latest books, that is the latest book, The Mask of Africa. You went around several countries. Can you say anything about that? Did you find any change from the previous ones?
Nadia's been whispering in my ear, the back here, and you asked that question and she answered for me. She said magic.
Yes.
And what I would say is that because of my writing, I became interested at a certain stage in the nature of belief, in the roots of belief. So, what I saw in Africa led me to look for the beginnings of belief. And that comes over in the book, yes.
I suppose that's...
They are, you know. Books are not what people make them out to be always. Although that has a value.
Will you continue to live in England? Because you've written 2 books, I think, that touch on life in England. The first one you wrote in Kashmir when you were going through,
yes.
And that was Mr. Stone,
yes.
and the Knight's Companion. You said something about that recently to me. Could you repeat it to the audience?
Tell me what I said.
What you said?
Yes.
You said it was a book you regretted having written.
Yes, yes.
And I said, pocket your regret, because it is a fine, small novella. And it does really reflect on particular characters in England which are captured as well as anything that Dickens did. And the other, of course, was The Enigma of Arrival.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. The book which talks about your life.
That's a profound work, yes.
But interleaved with Trinidad, with history. Do you find writing that in that sort of form, as you did in Enigma, and in A Way in the World, where you wrote the history of the adventurers in the Caribbean, coupled with modern-day descriptions and stories? Is it a deliberate attempt to change the form of what one calls the novel?
No. Nothing as ambitious as that. You know, Farrukh, the first thing to consider in a writer's body of work is the fact that he had to write the book to keep going, to make a living. So always remember that a writer has to make a living and has to write a book.
How can I forget?
Yes, 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 yes. So there is no brilliant
About form.
yes, 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 yes.
Did you see it as an innovation in form, or it just struck you that the book ought to come out that way, interleaved history and modern observation?
Yes, I have never written a book consciously doing new things or consciously trying to find a new way. I've written always with the feeling that this is the best way to deal with this material. It's as simple as that.
Now, we've got 1 minute left, so I will ask you, do you think the audience?
Question?
Can we have 1 or 2 questions? I can see lots of hands going up. Can somebody please give this lady a microphone?
He's going to sign.
All right.
You can announce it. They can buy the books.
The question is this, that India today, in my experience, still seems to require, a lot of Indians seem to require a lot of compassion, because the fact is that they seem to be struggling against a system that's not quite supporting them. What is your view on that?
Oh, you have to tell me what is being said. I can't hear.
She said in India needs a lot of compassion because its population is struggling against systems that don't support life as they want it or their rights. Do you have any view on that?
Compassion.
Why do they need compassion?
More than any other country. Why do you need compassion more than other people? Tell me. What's the lady saying?
She says that India seems to have many more people who are not supported by the socio-political systems, say. Would you agree or oppose that?
You don't see the question.
Vidya?
No, I don't want to answer the question.
Nothing to say to that, sorry.
There's
One
a
more?
question there. Oh, Ram! There's Ram there.
Mr. Jethmalani, yes.
You're
please.
going to be provocative, I know. There's Ram.
Yes.
Vidya, there was a time when I was very angry with India, contemptuous almost, because I found that the best intellectuals in the country had turned into sycophants. There was nobody willing to speak the truth, and people were really crawling before people in power. And now that you find that all the people in the world, in the country today, the poorest among them, enjoy a joke which I don't know whether you have heard. The joke is that if one politician falls into the river and drowns, it will be a simple case of pollution. But if all the politicians in the country were to drown and die at the same time, that is the solution.
Just laugh.
What was said?
Why do you call it area of darkness? I think it is area of light which has come into existence, and it is not a wounded civilization, it is a live civilization.
Bravo.
He says if one politician drowned, it would be a case of pollution. If all the politicians drowned, it would be a case of the solution. No. Yeah. Do you have any comment on that?
He's teasing
Or
you.
is that just
Yes, yes,
pessimistic?
yes, yes, yes.
What do you think of the joke?
Ram's a friend, and that's a very friendly comment.
Right.
Anybody
I'm told that the session has to end now, so I would thank you very much for the attention you've given Sir Vidya, and
Farrukh will be signing.
and Vidya will sign books at the signing counter if immediately after this session. Thank you very
Ladies
much.
and